So it's it's a big pleasure for me to announce this meeting. Last week we met with Professor Carol Ebdon. She came to Cholet University for 2 weeks and she is teaching our students. She has a lot of meetings with the faculty, with our rector, and now we have one of her activities divided to wide public from local services, from municipalities, from other universities, and expect and hope that there will be some people who will join us online. We are very happy that you are joining us. If you see me and could hear me, and really we are very happy about this visit of Professor Carol Ebdon. She's from our old partner, old not because of big amount of years, but really we have a very close relationship with Nebraskos University at Omaha. We even use this acronym, UNO. It's much more easier because the name, the title is quite long, and especially close relationships are with the School of Public Administration. So I really very happy to introduce Professor Carol Ebdon from UNO, from School of Public Administration, who will provide today lecture on local government. And really, I expect that it will be fruitful discussions in some place of your lecture. And really, there are people who could ask some questions and are interested in the topic. So, floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Vilma. Is that working? Okay, great. Thank you, Achu. I'm so happy to be here. This is my 3rd time in Cholet. I really enjoy coming here, so I'm happy to have the opportunity to be here again. I thought what I would do today is talk a little bit about what's happening in the U.S. in local government. So what are some of the issues that we're struggling with, and what are some of the innovations or solutions that we're doing, some of which I think you are actually ahead of us on, and some of which we may be able to shed some light or give ideas for you. So what I really hope is that this can be a conversation, that it won't just be me talking, but I would really like to hear a lot about what you think is happening in Lithuania, or what are the challenges, particularly at the local government level, and what kinds of things and changes you're seeing. So that's what I'm hoping for today. I'm going to try to stand up here. If that doesn't work, we'll try something different, but I don't really want to stand back there. And I hope that the people that are online, I'll check once in a while to see if you have anything you'd like to talk about or ask me. So again, as Vilma said, I'm from the University of Nebraska at Omaha. My teaching and interest in research area is in local government, particularly in budgeting and public finance. So I deal with a number of areas related to partnerships, citizen participation, tax policy, agreements, contracts, agreements, partnerships, those types of things kind of are what and capital budgeting and management. Those are the things that I mostly focus on. And I also served as the finance director for the city of Omaha for several years. I ended that about, I don't know, 8 years ago or something. So I've gone back and forth in my career between being a practitioner and being an academic. So I kind of see both sides. So what I thought I'd do is start just a little overview on local government in the U.S. because I think it is quite a bit different from most other countries. And then I'll talk about the issues and the trends. At the local level, this is all local governments combined. This is where the money goes. So you can see that the biggest single area of expense at the local level is education. Because our schools, other than colleges, our schools are local level activities, not state or central level. And then the second big thing is healthcare. We spend a lot of money on healthcare. Those are mostly for government employees. And then protection, which would be police and fire, public safety types of things. Transportation is quite a big area, some welfare, and then a bunch of other things kind of combined. And then where the money comes from, about 1/3 of all local government money comes from other levels of government, so state governments and then the central level government. But that means that 64%, 2/3 of the money that local governments have comes from their own resources. So in many countries, the central government collects all the taxes and then distributes them to lower levels of government. That's not the case in the U.S. Local governments have their own authority given to them by state governments to tax. And so a lot of money, you can see that 41% of that money comes directly from taxes. So that's local governments levying property tax mostly, which is the tax on buildings and property, and then sales tax and income tax. So those are the big taxes for us. There are a variety of other things. And then what's become increasingly common over the last 40 years is user charges. So utilities, if a city has an electric utility, they charge utility rates for their customers. So those are the types of things that would be in the user charges. We have a lot of different local governments. We have, I think, 90-some thousand if you add those up. Cities are 19,000. So the first three listed here are what we call general purpose government. So they serve more than one purpose. They serve multiple purposes. So cities do a variety of functions. There's 19,000 of those. Counties are bigger than cities. So for instance, I live in Douglas County, which includes the city of Omaha, the city of Ralston, several other cities. So the county does different functions than the cities do. The cities are within that county. And then some townships, which are small little jurisdictions. And then school districts. Some of our school districts are part of a city or county government, but most of them are their own entities. So they're not actually part of the municipality. So a school district exists as a separate government with a separate governing board. And then we have 38,000 special districts, which are districts that do specific things, like an airport, for instance, might be its own separate government. A fire district in a small community might be of its own separate government. So you can see that the real important thing here is that we're very fragmented. We don't have one municipality that does everything within that geographic area. It's all split up into these little things. So I live in maybe 7 different local governments. I'm in a school district, a county, a city, an airport authority, a utility district. So there's a whole bunch of things. So there are all those different governments that are serving me at the local level. So that makes it quite different from, I think, a lot of countries. And then, so talking specifically about cities, we have different forms of government. So every city is not structured the exact same way. So some cities are run by a strong mayor who's elected by the people, and then is sort of like at the central level. The mayor then is the chief executive, and then there's a legislative branch which is separate. So the powers are split between the mayor and the city council. So some of our cities operate on that form of government. Some cities operate on what we call the council manager form of government. And in that form, there's a city council that heads the government. So they're the legislative branch, and there's not really an executive branch because the city council hires a professional city administrator. And that we call the city manager. And so that city manager is usually somebody that has a master's degree in public administration, so is trained to do that job. And they report directly to the city council. So there's not one elected chief executive in this form of government. It's an appointed individual who then reports to the city council. So those, you can think about, understanding how public administration works in politics, you can think about how different the outcomes might be in those two different forms. So in the council manager form, we tend to think about that as being a little more efficient because that professional city manager isn't supposedly concerned about politics. They're concerned about running the government in an efficient way, in the best way possible. Whereas in the mayor-council form, the mayor is separate from the council. They may not agree. There might be a lot of political conflict between them, so it might be harder to get things done. But there might be more accountability because that mayor reports directly to the people, as do the city council members. So there's a lot of research about the effects of these two different forms, lots of studies, and to be honest, the results are very conflicting, very mixed. So it really depends. And then the other thing that varies a lot is the actual functions of city government. So this is just a list of things that are usually done in cities. So usually they have police and fire, libraries, streets, garbage, planning, and parks and recreation. But not always. And then often they might also have some utilities. As I said, they may or may not have the education function. Usually they don't. Usually education is separate. Airports sometimes are part of a city or county. Sometimes they're on their own. So this makes it very difficult to study city governments in the U.S. because there's such a wide variety both in how they're structured and the types of activities that they provide. So that makes it a challenge for academics and scholars. So just talking a little bit about some of the issues that I see. And again, I look at this from one lens. So this is what I see. If you had another one of our faculty here, which you do regularly, you might ask them this question, and you'll get a very different answer from them on what the issues are. Since I study budgeting and finance, and I think that everything is about money, I think about the fiscal side first. So to me, one of the biggest challenges is fiscal stress. We had the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. Many cities have not recovered from that yet. They're still struggling with the effects of that. They had to put off spending. They had to close things. They had to lay people off. And so they're still kind of figuring out how to come back from that. So that's been a big problem. The other thing that kind of is central to this whole fiscal issue is that in our country, people hate taxes. They hate them, even though I know nobody loves them, right? But our country, if you compare the U.S. to other industrialized, like all the countries in Europe, we're at the bottom. We tax much less than other countries do, but our citizens think that we are way overtaxed. So this is a big problem because then it makes it hard for the elected officials to be able to raise the taxes that they need to provide the services that people want. So this anti-tax idea has just become worse and worse and worse. And what doesn't help is that every politician that runs for elected office says, I'm going to cut your tax. Your taxes are too high, so I'm going to cut your taxes. And at the same time, I'm going to give you more services. And for some reason, people think that's possible. They want to pretend that that can happen. And then, of course, it doesn't happen, so people just get more upset. So we have this cycle, and that really is behind a lot of the issues that we have. And then the other thing is that we have tax limitations in many places. Many local governments have to deal with limits. So they have authority to raise taxes, but in many cases they can only raise them to a certain level. So if you are, for instance, the city of Omaha has a tax limit on property taxes. They're way below that limit. So they don't have to worry about this in the city of Omaha, but politically they can't raise them. So legally they could, but politically they can't, or those people would never be reelected to office when the mayor would not be reelected. So in some places, but in some places, these tax limits are very real, and it prevents them from being able to increase their taxes. And then the states have a lot of control over local governments, so they can decide at any time, they can tell localities that you can't do certain things, and they also frequently tell local governments that you have to do things. And the federal government does that as well. I've been talking to a couple of people this week about people with special needs, with disabilities, and how the EU is trying to impose some standards on that, so that organizations are now having to make some changes in their buildings. So to include lifts, for instance, if you have multiple floors, so that handicapped people can use them. Well, this happened maybe 20 years ago in the U.S., and then all local governments had to abide by that. And we had a period of time in which we had to change all of our buildings, our sidewalks, all sorts of things, so that people with special needs, with wheelchairs or whatever, could use those. And so that was very expensive, but that's just one example of a mandate. I mean, obviously it was a good idea, but it was very expensive. And then the other thing is we have a lot of demand for more services. And those come in kind of, I package them into, I think, 3 different areas here. One is economic development. Our states and local governments all compete for businesses. Everybody wants more businesses in their city. They want more factories, they want more company headquarters, because that's going to bring jobs, it's going to bring people to that area to pay taxes and make the economy better and the community stronger. So that's a great idea. The problem is that what that means is they're all giving away money to businesses to come there or to stay there. And this gets very expensive, as you can imagine. And if a community doesn't have a lot of money to begin with, it's harder for them to compete. And there are a lot of issues with this in terms of who are you, in terms of equity, who are you going to give the money to? Which companies deserve it more than other companies? And we've had a lot of bad cases, some failures where this has happened. And here's the best example right now is if you're familiar with Amazon. Amazon decided, they're headquartered on the West Coast in the state of Washington, and they decided that they were going to expand and they wanted to build 2 new headquarter buildings. And so they asked a bunch of local governments to supply bids for moving their headquarters. Well, so everybody was competing against each other to try to give the most money to Amazon. Now, Amazon doesn't need our money, right? They've got a lot of money because we're all buying things from them. So they don't need the money, but they had this competition. And this is where we ended up. We ended up that 2 communities won the bid. They're going to get Amazon headquarters. It's going to bring 25,000 new jobs into each of these communities. So that's a big deal. But it's going to cost over $2 billion. That's a lot of euros. I can't tell you how many, but it's a lot. So $2 billion is what those state and local governments had to come up with to get Amazon. So if you think about what that is for each of those jobs, it's a pretty high. I mean, they could have just paid those people that amount of money instead of paying Amazon. So that's one thing. And then social services is another area. It seems that we have a lot of trouble getting any policies at the central government level anymore for a variety of reasons. But our politicians at the central level can't do anything. So increasingly it means that state and local governments are having to do more. So these big social policies like poverty and homelessness and children's obesity and education, crime, all those things are more local, and it's left to the local jurisdictions and the local community to figure out how to deal with those. But those are too big for just a government to deal with on their own. And so there's a big need to figure out how to work together to solve these social issues. So we have at the federal level, we have a minimum wage. Everyone there's a law that you can't pay a person less than a minimum dollar wage. I think it's $7-something per hour is the minimum wage. But that hasn't increased in quite a while. But we can't get it increased at the federal level because of politics. And so if you lived making that amount of money on a full-time job, you can't live. And so people that make that wage have to work multiple jobs. They have a very hard time living, or they're relying on welfare, food stamps, that kind of thing. And so a lot of local governments have taken it upon themselves to have a minimum wage in their city that's much higher than that federal level. So that's something that doesn't really make sense. It should be a federal policy, but local governments have had to do that. Here's one example. I had a student do a paper on this last semester, so I've been very interested in this. We have a lot of homeless issues in some, especially big cities. And one of the solutions that some communities have come up with is having villages of these tiny homes. Tiny homes is a new movement in the U.S. because we have these big houses. We have increasingly had bigger and bigger and bigger houses, but we don't need big houses. So now some people are going in the opposite direction, and they're trying to minimize what they own, what they have, and try to live as simply as possible. And so there's a movement towards these tiny homes that people are living in that are just very small. And so now the idea is to create villages of these tiny homes for homeless people where they can live, they can have their own space, and they can live in a community. They all have to work. They all have to do some work to help the community, but it's a way to help them help themselves and have some privacy instead of having to sleep in a shelter in a big room like this with 100 other people. So that's just one simple little example. And then entertainment venues is another area where people want more. So they want to have more fun. They want to have sports arenas, and they want to have stadiums for sports, and they want to have convention centers to bring meetings to the community. And then cities have to build hotels to go along with those convention centers. So there's a lot more local governments that are getting into this business than used to be the case. And it's very expensive, and all the studies show that it doesn't really make sense from a financial standpoint, But again, they're all competing with each other, and so they have to do this. And of course, that costs taxpayers. Another big thing is infrastructure. Roads and buildings and bridges and vehicles and equipment. All those things, we have a really serious problem. Again, back to the Great Recession, when we didn't have money for a few years, the easiest thing to do was to defer maintaining things. So we weren't maintaining roads, we weren't replacing vehicles, we weren't fixing buildings, putting new roofs on buildings that needed them. And so that all has built up. And so it's been really, really hard to get those things fixed. And for roads especially, that's a big issue because our roads are mostly funded through a federal level gas tax, a tax on gasoline for our vehicles. But that hasn't been raised since, I think, 1993 or something. So it's been the same amount of cents for every gallon of gas we buy. And of course, costs to fix roads go up every year, but the revenue hasn't gone up. And in fact, it's gone down because we get more gas mileage now than we used to because we have more fuel-efficient vehicles. We were talking about that over the weekend. And so we're getting less revenue in that source. And there's no, the federal politicians aren't willing to raise that gas tax rate. So that just makes it worse and worse. So this is kind of embarrassing, but there's an organization of civil engineers that grade our infrastructure every year. And you have to be a little careful. They're a little biased because they're civil engineers and they make money by fixing roads and all those kinds of things. So they're a little biased. So you have to assume that this is a worst case scenario. But these are the grades that they give to our infrastructure in our country. So an A is really good. You don't see any A's. The only B's you see, the only B you see is for railroads. And everything else is C with a whole bunch of D's. So bridges, C+. Well, that's a little scary if you're driving on a bridge and you think it's, on average, only a C+. That's not very good. So overall, they give our infrastructure a grade of a D+. So that's just a signal. And again, that's biased. But even if they're off by one grade, that would be a C+. C+ is pretty bad. So we have a lot of work to do in that area. And then the last thing I want to mention is just because I've started doing a little work in this area, so I'm kind of interested in it, and we should talk about this film because it's an HR issue, about the workforce. That it used to be that in our country, people wanted to work for the government. The salaries were good, the benefits were really good, and it was a nice steady job. You were assured you probably weren't going to lose your job because it was very steady employment. So you could go to work for the government when you were 20 and work there for 30 or 40 years and have a really good retirement. People don't want to do that anymore. First of all, they don't like government for a lot of the reasons I've already said. Government is not in good favor in the U.S. right now. There's not much trust in government. People don't like it. People think of it very negatively. So they don't really have any incentive to work for government. And in addition, we have a younger generation that looks at life very differently than my generation or my parents' generation. And we call them the millennials. The millennials don't see themselves working in one job for their whole career. They want immediate satisfaction. They don't want to do boring, tedious, day-to-day work that is involved in most of the jobs that we do in government. They want to, be a manager right away and do exciting, fun things and not do that boring stuff. They don't like the bureaucracy. They don't really trust government either. So, and they don't want to stay in one place forever. They want to move around. They don't care about the security as much. That's not important to them. And so it's a whole different world. So we don't have a lot of people that are interested in government service anymore as a result of these things. They're interested in nonprofit organizations, NGOs, but not so much government. So that's kind of a problem if you're trying to encourage people to work for government. And here's what I think is an interesting statistic about public trust in government in the U.S. So this starts in a little bit before 1960, and it's based on an annual question that's asked, and it's about, do you trust the government in Washington a lot or somewhat, I think is the language. So this is Washington. This isn't your local government. The numbers are higher if you look just at local government, but we don't have it all the data going back like that. So I think this one's interesting. And you can see, it doesn't really matter who's president. It's going down. It went up quite a bit when we had 9/11. So then we were very patriotic and we thought government was good again. But then it went back again after that. So that's a really bad sign. So we're down to less than 25% of people that trust the government in Washington. How do you think that compares in Lithuania? You think higher in Lithuania? Yeah. In the central level, state level. Yeah, so these that we have. So I would like to ask you now, before I get into some of the things we're doing about it, I'd like to hear from you what you think are the major issues, whether it's the state level or whether it's the local level. Oh, okay. So what would you say are the big issues here? I'm sorry, I'm putting you on the spot.
Thank you, Professor, for a very interesting presentation and issues you mentioned. But could you comment more about this last slide? What has happened with the last two, let's say, presidents that the public trust went down? We thought that Obama was quite popular president. So what are main issues about this?
That's a good question, and I'm not really sure of it, how, I don't have a full answer to that, but what I will say is Obama was very popular compared to Trump. So this question, let me look at what the language is specifically. I want to make sure I get it right. Oop, I can't read this, can I? Okay. It's something like, trust the government in Washington always. Do you trust the government in Washington always or most of the time? So it's not just the president. It's the president and Congress. Congress has extremely low trust levels. They don't get anything done because there's so much what we call gridlock. Democrats, we have two parties, Democrats and Republicans, they don't get along with each other, and so we're at a point where there is almost no ability to compromise to get anything done. It's a real big problem. So if you look at the president separately from Congress, the president generally has much higher trust level than Congress does. So it's Congress that's really pulling this down. But also there's, again, a big split between Republican and Democrat, between conservative and liberal. And they don't, we seem to have less and less ability to talk to each other. We watch different news programs, and we think that so there's Fox News is considered conservative, and MSNBC and CNN are considered liberal now, which I don't know why. And so, you know, if you're on this side, you don't watch that show. If you're on this side, you don't watch that. They read different papers. So they're just so polarized that people don't, we now think that everybody else is just completely wrong and we can't even talk to each other. So that's kind of what plays into this. I don't know if that's really answering your question. But yeah, Obama was popular. Trump is a lot less popular overall, but the people that like Trump love him. And he can't do anything wrong, according to them. Now, there are many of us that are not Trump lovers, but those that do just have enormous trust in him. So that's the answer.
One more interesting, your mentioned issue is the model or form of managing the city. You mentioned two forms, mayor and the council and the manager. In our case, we have, let's say, mayor selected by the society. It started just a few years ago. And we have the council, like a legislative one, as you know, but we have administration, which is quite political one, but still managing the city issues. So my question would be connected with this. You mentioned about different results of different studies. Which form is more efficient or more accountable? So what is your opinion about the form which one is more liked by you as a researcher and scientist?
Thank you. That's another good question. And I will tell you my opinion, but I will also tell you that there are others who don't agree with me. So, for instance, Dr. Blair, whom you all know, who's been here and may be coming back again in the spring, Dr. Blair teaches local government, that's his area. So he's a really big advocate of the council manager form of government. He thinks that's the best and only way that local government can work, should work. So there are many people like that, you know, he goes to all the conferences for the International City Managers Association, which is the professional association for all those managers. He's very involved in that, very active, very well known in that community. So he just thinks that's the only way, the best way. So we have arguments about this because I worked for the city of Omaha, which is not that form of government. It's a mayor-council form. And I think that in some communities, particularly larger cities, it's very hard to have a council manager form because there's so much to get done that it's hard for the manager to have to be accountable to 7 or 10 or 20 different council members. The other thing that differs a lot is the number of city council members. Some communities might have 5. There are some cities that have 50 council members. So imagine if you were an appointed official that reported to 50 different people. And your job depends on that because you're going to get fired if you're not doing a good job. That's very difficult because they don't all agree. So you're having to every day figure out which people you should be, which of the council members, which of your bosses you should be paying attention to. So I just think in larger cities, sometimes it's, which tend to be the cities with those larger council sizes, that it's just hard. It's just a lot harder for that professional level of government. I agree that the council manager does tend to be more professional. Definitely. They tend to hire more professional department heads, people that have expertise in those areas. If you find in a mayor-council form, it's more likely that they're going to have more political type people that they appoint to those jobs. So I definitely agree with that. So I do think there's probably more efficiency in a council manager form. But I just think there are, particularly in big cities, it's a difficult form of government to have because of the politics. That's my personal opinion. But like I said, I don't agree with Dr. Blair, and I have arguments about this.
Thank you. And could I just look at our some investigation from some Baltic office that usually measure trust. So what they said, the research was done in the report was published on October. So what they said that people, the highest trust, it's 91%, gives to emergency services, then policy. It's strange, but it seems that we Constitution Court, Lithuanian Army, it's military, 70% trust on church, president, the same 70%, and then some separate, it's 10, they name the 10 that Lithuanians trust more. So it's Lithuanian bank, media, and the Department of Security in the interior security or something like that. Yeah. And what they said later, but so government is not on the 10 of mainly trust, so they had less than 60% of that, so it's close that it could be about half of people who trust. But what they said that from the last inquiry, people, comparing with last inquiry, people get higher marks to government. but just in 4 percentage points. So it's not so much. So it's maybe less than 60, but a little bit higher than last time when they inquiry the mm, how people in Lithuania trust the government. So I think it's more optimistical
Definitely.
scenario.
Yeah, definitely. Especially president. 70% for president. Oh my God.
Yeah.
We'd never get anything near that high.
That's interesting. Yeah, right. Mhm. Yeah, after second cadention, after 8 years. Yes.
Oh wow.
Still
That's
very high
amazing.
trust. Yeah. I think Lithuanians at all trust in women more.
Well, if we ever could have a female president, we might have that high level trust too, but I don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime the way things are going.
Yeah. So we could just respond to your what issues in Lithuania in local government is. So I think they are very common. Just we have, and I think in all Europe we used to have a very common model of local government. It's just one model, mostly just one model, just different issues on how we elected our council and mayor and how city manager is appointed. So it's different in that in all the Europe. So we had.
What can I ask about that? Because I know you just started electing the mayor.
Yeah.
What kind of changes have you seen as a result?
Of elections? It is the first cadency. So we will see, I think someone will make some observation of that after the first cadency will be at the end. So it will be maybe next year, the beginning of next year. But what issues we know and we see from our practical observations and what happens in several, I mean, like tendency, more like tendency than exception. So the first one issue, and that was mentioned as well in the report of annual report of our president, that we have committees. So mayor could be elected not just as a part of some party, some movements. I mean, citizens are very active. They make some or they create some movement, and the mayor could be not from the party that has political party that usually has deep traditions, but from very fresh movements. So what happens when those several mayors were elected, not from political side? There was a lot of competing and fights between mayor and council, because mayor hasn't big support from council, as most in the councils are from formed from and fractions that they formed are political oriented. So that was really a lot of events, a lot of some very strange scandals, even scandals in Lithuania, because of these opposition of mayor and council. Even now in Chile we have the same. It is the last months of mayor, and political parties united to make an impeachment for mayor.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Whoa.
And we are not, and mayor gets them to the court because of the because of the not because of it was not truth. Slander. So that's interesting. It is. You could imagine new elections will be on March, and impeachment on the last months of yeah. So that is the issue of these elections. It is the just first time for us. So I think a lot of what we should learn in this kind of how to deal with this issue. Another one, what as well we could see, and we talk with these supervising institutions who supervise how councils are worked, is the how decisions are made. So if a mayor has support from council, that means that the territory are going to high development level. We have example from Akmeni district. Mayor is Social Democrats, and they have a majority of Social Democrats in council. And they did really very big step in economical development, because they invite several foreign investors. So they agreed together on some lower taxes, on better conditions for those lower foreign investors. They get some local support, I mean Lithuanian support, higher support for developing of infrastructure or from regional policy. And I think they, as a whole council and mayor, they really create good strategy. So we just joke sometimes, and we hear the joke not just from academical side, but from our politicians from other Šiauliai region municipalities, that not Šiauliai now is the center of the region. Because Akmenė is growing very, very fast. And that is because of this good connection between good support for ideas of mayor from council. So there are good examples of good issues of this new election forum for us, but as well it could be very, very frightening issues, yeah, because if there is supportive relationships, so usually we have a lot of examples in Lithuania, usually the municipality has economical growth. If there are these fighting issues, so a lot of impeachments, fightings, and not productive work. So I think our politicians still should learn some new things in this very new situation. Yeah, because before it was much more easier. The majority elect or appoint mayor from their side, so it was easier to make decisions. Now, mayor could not be from the majority of politicians. Yeah, especially Šiauliai could be, I think, worst example of how long it takes to, you know, to balance the yeah. And even with the citizens, and yeah, so that is issues in Lithuania. Yeah. And right, yeah.
So lack of communication as well as the relationship between the mayor and the council.
Yeah. So I think that is the main issues. Maybe you could add something. Mm-hmm.
This, by the way, would be a great study. I hope that some of you are looking at this as a research study. Oh, that's great.
Professor, could you share your experience from United States in the model when the mayor and the council is the main government in the local government? So we have some cases, let's say not like tendency, but exceptions, when new mayors came and they are, I would say, entrepreneurs as themselves, like persons, first of all, and we see wonderful projects, wonderful decisions, and huge socio-economic development in those cities or districts. Let's say Kaunas city, let's say Akmenė district, and so on. So sometimes we even think that some personal capabilities or capacities or skills are sometimes more important than, let's say, your vision or strategy or political program coming to become a mayor. So could you share your experience? What kind of mayors are successful in the United States?
That's a really good question. You're getting a little off my topic, but yeah, it's an interesting question. And I'll try not to talk about presidents because I'm thinking about President Trump as you're saying that. So I'm going to try not to talk about Trump. Yeah, at the local level, I do think there is a lot about the skill of the mayor. I think it's a few things. I think it's how much they're willing to learn about government, how much they know about government and are willing to learn about government. So if they come in, so for instance, if we elect a businessman who doesn't really know anything about government, government runs very differently from business in the US. It's just very different. We're very transparent. Everything has to be done publicly. There are rules about everything. You can't just give a contract to your friend. You got to go through this big process and have, the low bid and all that stuff. So for somebody that comes from a business, it can be very frustrating and take some time to understand that. So that's one of the downsides about having a good businessman. They don't really, a good business person, they don't always understand that. So it's not just their expertise in the business world, it's that willingness to understand government. And then it's also the communications, I think. To what extent are they willing to communicate with the people they need to? And understanding who those people are is important, because it's not just the city council sometimes. It might be the Chamber of Commerce, or it might be some very involved citizens groups. So in our community, we have a bunch of very rich people. They give a lot of money to government, which I'll talk about in a little bit if we have time. And so those people are very important. You don't necessarily have to listen to them, but you have to talk to them. So I think it's figuring out who those people are that you have, who the important stakeholders are that you need to be in communication with. And I also think that it's about understanding your role and figuring that out pretty quickly. I've seen in Omaha, for instance, very different models of mayors. The mayor I worked for, I thought was excellent. He was very focused on some very specific things. And all the rest of the day-to-day business of the government, he didn't really care about. And he let the department managers deal with that. He did not micromanage. He focused instead on the big things. And he also understood that he wasn't going to get full credit for everything that happened, and that it was important for him to share credit. So sometimes that meant sharing credit with the council members that he often disagreed with. Sometimes that meant sharing credit with some other organizations. He didn't have such a big ego that he wasn't willing to share credit, and he realized how important that was in getting things done. So I really respected that. You knew exactly what was important to him and what he was looking to achieve, and you could tell. So it was very clear to tell whether he achieved or not. Whereas other mayors I've seen have been very micromanagers, and they've been very focused on the inside runnings of government, which has meant that the big things like the economic development didn't necessarily happen. So that's just my experience. Again, that would be a really good question to ask Dr. Blair, because he's studied the local government management side more than I have, but it's a good question. And it'd be really interesting to compare what you're seeing here to what we've experienced. Okay, so I just thought I'd talk about three, and I know we're running out of time, but quickly I'll tell you three kind of areas that I think are big trends or things where we're seeing a little bit of innovation, and it's around these three areas. So the first one's about partnerships. Again, because we have no money, and because, remember, our governments are very fragmented, and we have a lot of organizations. We have business organizations, we have NGOs, we have all sorts of, we have big local volunteer stakeholder groups and citizens groups and neighborhood groups. So we have all sorts of organizations. And so in order to and as I said, we have all these big social issues we're trying to deal with, as well as economic development and all these other services that people want. And so what we're seeing is that governments are more often, instead of just being the only organization doing something, they're building partnerships with different kinds of organizations. So we partner with other governments a lot. We have what we call interlocal agreements. I just finished a study of this in Nebraska, and it's very interesting to see over time how much these agreements have increased in both number and dollar amounts. So for instance, if you're a small city within a county and you don't have a lot of money, it doesn't make sense for you to have your own police force. So instead, you might contract with the county who has a police force to provide your police services for you. So you pay them money, but they're providing you the service. So we do a lot of that between governments in a number of different ways. And those are good because you can save money, they might have more expertise, so there's more economies of scale from an economic standpoint. So that makes sense. We're also seeing a lot more connections between NGOs and governments. And this is just going to get bigger as we go along. And there's really three main things that we see here. One is that the government just gives money to a nonprofit to do something because they're doing valuable things in the community. So some of that happens. So a government might give, maybe there's a nonprofit organization that provides a homeless shelter. And we don't like to see homeless people downtown, you know, just sleeping on the street. That doesn't look good to our tourists. We don't like that. So we might just give a bunch of money to a nonprofit organization to be able to increase their homeless shelter. So that would be a grant. Or we might contract with an NGO to provide a specific service where we're expecting them to do X number of things for us. That's pretty common as well. And then more recently, lately, and again, this kind of goes back to the big social issue thing, we're seeing a lot more of networks where there are a bunch of organizations that come together to try to solve a problem. It might be homeless, it might be poverty, it might be education. So we'll have groups that will be working together on a regular, they'll have meetings every month or every 2 months, representatives of all these organizations coming together to figure out what can we do as a community to solve this problem. So it's not necessarily even the government that's leading it, it's the government is a participant in this network. And so again, those are food policy councils is a new example of that. I have a student studying that right now, one of our doctoral students. So food is an issue for us. You can't get good food, and if you live in a poor neighborhood, you can't get fresh fruits and vegetables. Our children are obese. We have a big problem. It's a health problem. So we have all these people trying to come together and figure out how do we solve this issue. So this is kind of exciting, and there's a lot of new research on this as well. So that's a good area for academic research. And then a lot of partnerships with the private sector as well. Again, sometimes this is just contracts where we're contracting with an organization to pick up our garbage for us. But sometimes it's more complicated public-private partnerships. Europe is way ahead of us in public-private partnerships. You've been doing it for much, much longer than we have. We're just starting. We haven't had great experience with it, but we're starting to do this for like operating our toll roads, for instance, where we'll have 50 or 75-year agreements with a consortium of private companies to operate the road for us, or operate ports so that they can so that we can get big projects done that otherwise we don't have the money to do. So, and in theory, these have shared risk with them. And then the last thing, because I do work on this, and I think this is an interesting phenomenon, is this idea of private donors giving money to governments to do things, which I know you have an example here. One of the students told me last week about in Vilnius that somebody gave money for an art museum, a modern art museum. And that's a great example. We are seeing this more and more in the US because, again, governments don't have any money, and so we're seeking money not just from taxes, but from donors. Normally we think of donors giving money to NGOs, not giving money to the government, but this is starting to happen more and more. The Gates Foundation is big on this. They've helped a lot of libraries, for instance. They do a lot in the health area, so they're helping public organizations that are doing health projects. We had one of the examples in Omaha, and I think I might have talked about this last time I was here, is this baseball stadium that we built, where we had these rich donors that gave the city $40 million towards a $140 million project to build the stadium. And it was pretty controversial, but we couldn't have done it otherwise. People are very happy about it now, but there were a lot of issues at the time. The public didn't get to vote on it. It was really done behind closed doors. We basically let the donors dictate who was going to build it. So all those things we say that you shouldn't do about transparency and corruption and all that. So there were a lot of issues with it, but we got this beautiful new stadium. So there are a bunch of issues with this in terms of accountability. Do we really share the risk? We're making very long-term decisions without a lot of public input. So there are some things that need to be worked out. And one bad example, one of the earliest pre-P or P3 projects in the U.S. was Chicago, which entered into a 75-year agreement for their parking meters with a private company. And it was not a very good deal, and they got a lot of money. The city got $1.15 billion, which was nice, but the public didn't understand it at all, and the rates that they had to pay for parking went up tremendously after this went into place. So the public was very angry, and of course they took their anger out on the mayor and the government, not on the company, because they didn't really understand who was running it. And then after they got all that money, which is all they're going to get for 75 years from this, they ended up spending most of it right away because that's when the Great Recession hit and they needed the money just to balance their operating budget. So it's pretty much all gone. So we have some things to learn. And the second thing, again, I'm just kind of going through this quickly, the role of citizens. And again, I study this, so this is something I look at, and I see some changes going on in this too. We have some, in our country, transparency is inherent in our structure of our governments, and there are a lot of requirements about requiring the ability of citizens to participate in things and to know what's going on. Every legislation is adopted publicly, and there are always public hearings before anything can be adopted. We have very specific ways for citizens to be involved, but you can see our turnout at our last mayoral election was 35%. And I remember I was here right after your elections, and you were complaining because I think the turnout was 70% or something. People thought that was low. Well, ours is 35%, and we're happy for mayoral. It's higher for federal. So we have a lot of built-in areas for citizens. But there are a lot of issues. There are a lot of issues with participation in terms of who is it that's going to participate. Not everybody has time to come to a public meeting, and you're only going to come if you have really strong feelings about it. It takes time and money to participate, and does it really have an effect anyway? But there are a lot of potential benefits to participation, which the literature, including some of the things I've written, have shown. And so we think it's important to try to do more participation. So some of the areas where we're seeing more of this happening are in, I just picked these 4 things. So surveys. A lot of our communities do satisfaction surveys of citizens regularly so that we know what's important to them, what they care about, which services do they think are being provided well, which ones do they think could be better. If we had more money, what should we do with it? Those kinds of things. So that's fairly popular. And then civic crowdfunding is a new thing. This is something that's been used for businesses and for nonprofits, and is actually starting to be used for governments, where you just go on social media and you're basically setting up a site for people to give money. And so we can use it for parks. We want to build a new park, but we don't have money in the city budget. So do people that live in that area want to contribute money to a park? Co-production is another thing, and this is getting a lot of academic attention as well. This whole idea of citizens actually being involved in providing the services, not just in talking about them. And so we have these 311 systems, and I know you have something similar here. You probably don't call it that, where you can go online and you can report there's a hole in the street, or the street light is out, or something. All sorts of things you can report online, and then you can track. So you can see exactly how many complaints have been filed in different areas, and you can track your complaint to see how long it takes to get fixed. So it's a way to not only do the reporting, but to also monitor. So that brings the citizens in and connects them in terms of providing the service. And then the last one is, and this is something I study, is that we're doing a lot more of this online participation, particularly in terms of budgeting, where you can go on, there are these games, basically. There are these companies that set up these games. Well, it's like a game. It's an exercise to balance the budget. So you go online and they'll create, here's the information from the budget, from the city budget, and we need to balance the budget. So we're out of balance by $1 million. So here are some options. What would you do to balance the budget? Of course, you don't have all the choices, but they'll make some big choices. Should we cut police? Should we increase property tax? Should we, what should we do? So you get a bunch of choices, and then you get to make decisions, and then until you balance the budget to see what you would do. So it's a way to educate citizens on the budget, as well as to get a better understanding of what they think we should be doing in order to balance it. So these things, I'm starting to do some research on actually trying to look quantitatively. I'm going to talk more about this on Wednesday, so I'll talk more then about this. But this is kind of a new thing, and I think it's kind of exciting because it really is a way to get to combine educating citizens with figuring out what they think. So I kind of like that, and it's a fun thing to do. And I was going to bring up some examples, but we had, because of the video conferencing, I couldn't do that. But I'd be happy to share these, and I have some examples of things if you want to look at them. But again, there's lots of issues with participation. The same things I talked about with traditional participation tend to be the problems here. How do you make sure that who's participating is representative of the community and not just people that can afford to have computers, for example? And how transparent is it really? And then the crux of participation is if you get people to tell you stuff, but then you don't listen to them, then it's a problem. And in the studies I've done on participation in budgets, this has been a big problem. So the elected leaders say that they care about participation, but then people say very clearly, this is what we want, but then they don't listen to it. So that's problematic. And then the last thing, again, just very briefly, is there's been a lot more emphasis in our country on long-term planning and on doing long-term planning actually using data instead of just doing what you want to do. So I'm just going to mention, I think, 3 things here. One is strategic planning, where you actually think long-term about what are the goals that we want to achieve, how can we measure our performance towards achieving those goals. So this is becoming popular as well. But this is where I would say there's a difference in this. Mayors, it's a little easier for a city with a council manager form of government to do this than it is for a mayor form, because a strong mayor is accountable to the people. And if a strong mayor comes out and says, okay, here are our goals for the next 5 years, and then doesn't achieve those, then the people on the city council that oppose the mayor can say, you didn't do what you said you were going to do. So there's some fear, there's some political fear of what the results are going to be, and they're going to make me look bad. So therefore, I don't want to do any planning, because then it'd be easier for my opponents to point fingers at me. So that's where I think form of government might make a difference, but I don't think there have been any studies that have actually looked directly at that linkage. So there's an issue with that. I have a really good example of this, which is the capital of Nebraska, which has a strong mayor government, by the way. But they have done a lot of work on this, and this website's really interesting to look at. They also link it to their budget as well. So they've done a lot of things on this. They have a whole bunch of measures. They have some very specific goals, and then the measures for the goals. So you can, and every year they update this, so you can see exactly how they're doing. And then capital improvement plans are pretty common in larger governments in the U.S., where we'll do a 5 to 10 year plan for our assets, our infrastructure. And it's pretty detailed, and more governments are using technology to better be able to really know what the condition of their assets are and when things need to be fixed, what it costs over the life cycle. So we know that it makes more sense to replace these vehicles after 3 years instead of letting them rot after 6 years, for instance. We historically have not been good at that overall. We're trying to get better. And then also to link that to the operating budget. If we build a new police station, what's that going to cost us to operate it every year? Because we have to have X number of more police officers, et cetera, et cetera. So we're starting to do more of that, but we still don't have a lot of money for maintenance, which is really the crux of the matter that I talked about earlier. And our technology, I think we're way behind Lithuania in technology. Our systems are still not very good. They don't talk. We'll have a system here that doesn't talk to this system, and where people don't know how to use them. So it's still pretty problematic. And then a lot of times we just want to build a new road because we want to run for re-election next year, and our citizens want that new road. They don't really understand that the pipes underneath the ground are rotting. And if those don't get fixed, we're going to be in big trouble in 3 years. So instead, we'll build the road instead of fixing the pipes. So there's still that problem. And then here's an example of a good CIP. And then the last thing is we're starting to also do more long-term forecasting for the operating budget, which has not happened at all. Typically, we do a 1-year or 2-year operating budget, and that's it. We're not thinking about the future. So it's become a lot more common to include in the budget a multi-year forecast so that we can focus on those long-term issues. But it's not, I would say it's not the most common thing, but it's becoming more common. And here's a good example of that. So that's it. Just be interested to hear, if we have any time left, about what changes you're seeing other than what we've talked about so far. And then I would just say that I think that a lot of what we need to be thinking about is what are the values that are most important to us as a community, and thinking about, as we make these changes, making sure that those values, that we're still able to achieve those values. If we value efficiency, then that means doing things a certain way. If we value equity, then sometimes efficiency isn't going to be good because then we are giving up equity. So we really need to figure out how to balance those values as we make changes. And then I'm also very interested in what this means for the role of public administrators. As we change, what skills, particularly as academics, what skills do we need to be teaching people versus the way we've been doing it in the past? Are there things we should be doing differently because of change in the way that government is operating? So that's it. I'd be interested to hear any other things about things that you see happening in Lithuania. Thank you.
Really, thank you so much. I think after 2 weeks staying there, it's too short time to understand what happens now. If you will come on, for example, March, it will be much more interesting before elections. So there will be a lot of publications everywhere, how things were worse and worse, and not so much things were better. So yeah, so what issues we have there in Lithuania?
Professor, you mentioned about 2 main political parties participating in managing all the state and federation, Democrats and Republicans. My question would be connected to what Lithuania should do to have a clear vision of what our political parties provide or offer to our people who has the right to vote. You mentioned that there is not very high interest in local elections in the United States. We have the same problem, but maybe we have a problem because we have more than 20 acting political parties and movements participating in the same elections. So what would be your insights about the structure of let's say political powers participating in elections, and which system has what kind of let's say challenges and maybe benefits from being variety of political parties and being just 2 or 3 political parties? Thank you.
I'm going to throw that back to you and ask what you think, because I only have experience in the U.S. Obviously, I've read about other countries and studies on other countries, but it's so different for us. But you can see how you compare to other countries in Europe, for instance. So what do you see as and I know most countries in Europe have a lot of parties, right? So what do you see as the strengths and weaknesses of that multi-party system?
I think it is an issue that people just lost between declared ideas of the party, of each political or each movement, because sometimes, and especially when we have these movements, which was mentioned in presidential this annual report, that it's okay when you want to be more active citizens. But in these elections, there will be about 200 movements. So you could imagine that there are 200 movements. plus 20 parties, maybe less. So it's scattering ideas. So people mainly vote for persons, not more their votes, their trust maybe is not more connected with ideology of party, of political party. So I think that's not very good, because what happens with these movements, they survive very short period, because there are no ideologies there. People just come together, declare that they love, for example, city or town. So in our case, they are lovers of town. I joke on that with students all the time. Would you will elect lovers of town? It's just like, love story. It can't be very long. Usually it ends after a very short period. Then we start some battles because of the power and between two lovers. So that is joke, of course, sarcastic joke, but that is, I think, question of these very young democratical states or countries that we are, that they are not balanced, the understanding of what political system, what is benefits from political system, from these political parties with long history, with reputation that you could trust. The trust is not still not the not the gold. I mean, in our case, it's just sometimes we just love or like. Not I trust the group because they did. For example, I really am very surprised about this big issue now in Chile, when for nowadays mayor collect very different people in the new committee, and they already announced that this big group of people, I'm not sure what they are doing, what their ideas are. They just love city and mayor, yeah, and they are going to elections. They want to be, and mayor is going to elections as well as mayor, and they are going to rule town. In which direction? With love. I'm very sarcastic on that, but that's, yeah, because people trust in love. It's just love. It's nothing more. So what we talk with our students all the time, that you should understand a little bit wider and deeper things, not just what they are, how they're nice, how they declare some very strange things, very strange things. Even I'm not sure I really will encourage our students to participate in all of those debates that will appear, I think, on maybe February, and ask some questions, particular questions about future, not about how they win. It's just, situation of winning. And after winning, everyone will be happy with this love that will come with us. So it's, yeah, for these new democratic countries, and you see what happens in a lot of countries now, is the same. It's not the logic of, it's ruined political system, and nothing new is proposed. So it's some very dangerous, in all the Europe is the same.
And you look at places like Britain, that's had a long-standing system with many parties, maybe not as many as this, but they're going through the same kinds of struggles, I think. So, yeah, it's very interesting. I guess what I would say, in thinking about this in terms of our two-party system, there's a couple things I would say. And again, I'm not a political scientist, so that's not what I study, but I have lots of friends who are. It used to be that in our two-party system, we had Democrats that believed more about the people. They wanted to help the people more, the basic people more, and they would spend more money in budgets, but less on defense. The Republicans, I'm exaggerating, but this was kind of what it was. The Republicans wanted to have a strong defense and more on police and things, and not help the average person as much, and have lower taxes. So that was kind of the two-party feelings. Most Americans were in the middle, kind of in between. And so people would run for office, they would start by talking about these extreme views, but then in order to win election, they had to come more toward the central because that's what most of us believe. But over time, we've changed our election structure so that we more live with people like us, that think like us. And so we keep electing people that are more this extreme or this extreme now. And so I don't think we've become more extreme, but because of the way we elect people, our elected officials are more extreme. And so that's a big problem now. So we don't have what most of us believe happening. Instead, we have these extremist views being represented. And I think that's the big challenge. The biggest challenge for us is how do we get back to that more central view. The other thing I would say is that in some of the things I study, one of the big issues I think across the board is the difficulty in institutionalizing any reforms. So we'll have citizen participation, get input, get started in a place, and it's working really well, and then the next mayor is elected, and the next mayor doesn't have any interest. But we'll do this great strategic plan, and then a new mayor comes in, or a new governor comes in, and they want to do something completely different. So it's very difficult to get good public administration reforms when you have that kind of change, and I think that would be even harder in the system you're talking about. So. Anything else?
In your case, when you have two political parties quite strong, one, I think that Americans can actively participate in debates, to watch debates. They are very interested in debates, especially when the president election comes. Yes, and I was a little bit shocked when it was debates of Republican Party, when one of candidates was a person who bankrupt personally. So I was just wondering how he's going to manage state budget or what kind of team he will choose. But at the same time, I can see the same strange things in our elections as well. Let's say, let's take some examples from local government. I'm, let's say, a voter of one traditional political party, which is quite big one in Lithuania, but I have a challenge with personalities. When it comes to the local level, the leader of the political party announced his program, political program, and there was a nice brochure about the goals of the political party and the leader. And the first task for him, for the leader, when he will become a mayor, was I will learn English, because now when I'm the head of department, I'm feeling not very well, not knowing this language. So for me, as a scientist, as a researcher, it looked very stupid to wait for get elected like a mayor to learn English. The same situation came to the mayor election of Šiauliai city. We had a huge debate between two strongest, let's say, candidates to the position of Šiauliai city mayor in national TV. And there was a task from the main head of this show that you have, let's say, last 1 minute to say the last offer for your voters. And the promise from nowadays our mayor was shocking. At that period, there were some, let's say, military movement around Lithuania. And as a members of NATO, we were very afraid from our neighbors, let's say, frightening military movements, because we were afraid of possible attack. And as you know, Šiauliai city has the airport, military airport, like a base of NATO. So in the case of attack, Šiauliai would be in the first target. So at that time, people were quite frightened about the situation. And the last minute offer for the voters was, I promise you, if you will elect me a mayor, there will be no war in Shule City. That was killing me absolutely. And this was the main reason why I did not go to the second stage of elections, and I did not vote, because I had no normal candidate to this position. And that means that, let's say in your case, 35% participated, but maybe other 65% has no vision in those candidates who participate in the main position. So what are your insights? How to encourage citizens to participate in those elections? And what you can see in the political programs of your mayors, like possible challenges and possible opportunities for our Lithuanian candidates to learn how to be elected. What kind of promises your mayors promise to the voters?
No, yeah, no, that's a new one. I don't think our mayors have promised no wars. It's pretty common to promise cutting taxes and increasing services, like I said. So it's not rational, not rational. But people love that. That's what they want to hear. So our current mayor is very popular. She's in her second term, and she ran. We imposed a new tax. This is a very long story, but we have a new tax that started in 2011, and it was needed because we had big pension problems in the city, and so we needed a new revenue source. And it was very controversial at the time. The mayor that imposed it didn't have a choice. We had been talking for years about having to do it. He didn't have a choice. He lost to this woman, Jean. And Jean came, and Jean was on city council, so she knew the whole story about, she knew the budget. She was on the finance committee. She understood the budget completely. She campaigned on lowering taxes, getting rid of this restaurant tax that we started in 2011. So she came into office, I think, in 2013. She cut the property tax a little bit, twice in her first term, just a little bit, not much, just a little bit, and didn't cut the restaurant tax, which she said she was going to cut. And so that hurt her a little bit when she was reelected, but she just told people, you know, I got in and I realized it couldn't happen yet. We really needed money, which she knew when she was on city council. She didn't learn anything when she was elected. She knew that before. But she won re-election. So it hurt her in terms of some of the votes she would have gotten, but she won. She's very popular otherwise. She listens to people, she's pretty, she talks to everybody, and so people like her. So I don't know that I think, to me, it's an education thing. I don't think we teach our children in primary and secondary school enough about civics, enough about government. And I think that's where the effort needs to be more. Because even the students, I don't know about you, but I teach public administration students, and I have students that don't seem to know much about government, don't seem to care much about government. So if they're not interested enough to vote or to be going to debates and asking questions, then I'm not quite sure what to do. But I will say, one positive thing is that social media is much more important than ever, and people are using that to be active and to get the truth out there. Now, there's also a lot of lies as well, but I think it's being used in some positive ways in helping with elections and helping get younger people more energized especially about certain issues. So I wish I had answers. We should come back in 2 years and talk more and see what's changed and if we have any good solutions. I tried to look here, and I don't think that anybody had any questions.
Okay, so I think it's time, and really we are very thankful for this possibility to discuss and to really compare different systems, not just administrative but as well political system, and that's an issue that it could be in the same way, so it should be different, and the differences is good. So it's just interesting to compare which works more in some cases, which issue could be more effective in some cases. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Ačiū.
Yeah, and you are welcome for the next public lecture on Wednesday. So thank you.